Welcome to Online Seller UK podcast. My name is Prabhat, founder at Online Seller UK, and today we'll be discussing about intellectual property infringement on Amazon. So I'm joined by David Miller, who has years of experience with working with Amazon sellers and helping them out for reinstatement and helping with infringement. So without further ado, welcome to our podcast, David.
Thanks, Prabhat. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So I think it's good for you to introduce yourself, and then we can take it from there.
Sure. So I'm David Miller. I'm the founding attorney at David Allen Miller Law PLLC. We represent Amazon sellers and essentially in all things pertaining to Amazon. So intellectual property disputes, business law matters, variety of different types of Amazon account and listing suspensions, in addition to a slew of compliance issues that come up on Amazon.
Okay. So let's talk about infringement. So let's talk about again. It looks like a negative topic, but it's not. In some ways, we want to find out how to respond to that as well. But a lot of times, I see people are getting incorrect infringement, infringement appeal. Well, not appeal, but issue. So so talk to us how to deal with situations like that, and then there are further other questions we'll talk about.
Right. So I think before even receiving complaints, it's really important for sellers to understand what intellectual property is and how to make sure you don't run into problems. It's never going to be foolproof, but it is worth taking the time so that if issues ever do come up, you're prepared. So the classic example is someone files, let's say, a counterfeit complaint against you, right? I can't tell you how many times a seller has contacted me and told me they're not counterfeit. And when I ask for evidence or how they know for sure it's not counterfeit, then there's always a story with they don't have invoices or they got it from the back of a truck. Of course, that's not always, the best case scenario is when you have a legitimate supplier, you have an invoice in hand, you know what you're buying and you know who it's coming from. Of course, it's in a perfect world, you have it directly from the manufacturer. So if you're buying the product directly from Nike or directly from an authorized distributor of a well-known brand, we have a very clear paper trail of where the product was coming from. Now, I understand that's in a perfect world. That's not always feasible. It's not always, I know there's profit margins and there's a lot of different numbers at stake. So sometimes it can be a long distribution chain and you don't necessarily know exactly where it's coming from. But as long as you do a good job in vetting your suppliers, you should be fine with counterfeit issues. Now, if they ever do come up, what we see is a lot of those brands or a lot of those complainants that file those claims, what they'll do is they'll try and reverse the burden of proof, right? So party A files a counterfeit complaint against party B. And when party B reaches out saying, hey, we didn't infringe, these products are legitimate, they say, show us an invoice. That's completely reversing the burden of proof. They're the ones who are supposed to have the evidence before they file a counterfeit complaint, right? So if they're just clicking buttons and just filing counterfeit claims without having any evidence, you would have your own legal claims against them for essentially accusing you falsely.
Okay, so that's an interesting scenario, but also let's talk about buyers complaining about the counterfeit as well. Not only the brands too. So there's I see there's two areas there. Buyers don't realize what sort of problems they are putting the seller into, I guess, because they just click a button, I would have thought.
Yeah, so it happens a lot when buyers claim products are inauthentic. Amazon bots sometimes will remove the products. Now, there's no specific number of negative reviews or when it specifically happens. But again, if a buyer complains about a product, it could be that it's damaged, or it could be as simple as it didn't look like it was new, and then it's flagged as a used sold as new issue. It's really important to just have everything in a proper file so that you are always prepared, because it's going to come up. You're going to have some sort of issue. Eventually, a buyer's not going to be happy. And you want to make sure you have the documents to show products are legit, they're purchased as new, and you want to make sure that the supplier is legitimate. If the invoice doesn't have the required information that Amazon typically asks for, you're going to have a problem. So it's not even always just a matter of the supplier being legitimate. You have to make sure the quantity is sufficient for your sales, right? So you can't send Amazon an invoice showing 10 units were purchased, but you sold 1,000 products. I've seen it happen. I've seen where the date that's provided, so the date on the invoice is after the complaint came up. So these are things that you have to stay on top of, in addition to, of course, vetting suppliers, check the quantity, make sure the spelling of the company is right, the address is correct. There are certain things in place that once you know how Amazon operates, you shouldn't have a problem.
Yes. Okay, good. So it's good saying we've got this document. So if another brand complains on the intellectual property to my account, to my brand, I think there is a whole complicated scenario of trying to communicate with them. So talk to us on this, and how does it work?
Right. So I think you're referring to more of trademark infringement and copyright infringement disputes.
Yeah.
So that's completely separate from counterfeit, right? Counterfeit is just they're authentic or they're not. Trademark infringement opens up several other doors, right? So there's a variety of different scenarios that can come up. Sometimes what'll happen is there are two different brands that have similar names, right? Similar branded names. And then it's a matter of who had the rights first. Are they similar enough? So again, it's an overall theme here is if you make sure that you're reviewing everything at the beginning, it's a sort of issue that is way more unlikely to come up. So when you're thinking about creating your private label brand name, it's highly important to do a thorough search to see if there are any similar brands. It's the last thing you want is to put in, thousands or tens of thousands of dollars into a brand, and then you have a problem that another brand is saying it's too similar to ours. So usually that comes up more when you're using descriptiveness language. And what I mean by that is when you're describing your products, right? So an example I always give is if you're in the TV business and you're selling TVs, a weak trademark would be crystal clear, for example, right? Because that's how someone would possibly describe a TV. It's a crystal clear TV. So then there are brands out there that will try and say, oh, I own that's my brand. I own the words crystal clear in relation to TVs, right? So that's just a common example of, the sort of issue that can come up with trademark infringement. And to add to that, very different, but also under the trademark umbrella, is material difference accusations, right? So I think there's pretty general awareness about what the first sale doctrine is. And that essentially just says that you can buy and resell legitimate, unaltered goods, right? Now, what some law firms will do is try and find exceptions to that general rule. So they'll claim material differences in products. Those can be physical differences. And what we see even more often than physical differences are non-physical differences with warranty disputes or satisfaction guarantees. So that's something else to always look into. If you're buying and reselling a popular brand name, I would always recommend looking at the warranty beforehand. Is it similar to what Amazon's warranty is? Is it similar to the A to Z guarantee? Or is it a lifetime guarantee that they're offering? If it's a lifetime guarantee, they have a much stronger claim of arguing that the products are materially different, which would equate to trademark infringement. I know that's a little bit of a mouthful, but there's a lot of different branches to trademark infringement. So I'm trying to sum up some of the more popular ones.
Well, it's infringement itself is a very complicated topic. So okay, going back to what we started talking. So how would we communicate with the seller or a brand who complained or who put infringement against us?
Right. So contacting the brand is essentially submitting a rights owner letter to them. And what this does is puts them on notice that you received their infringement claim and summarizing what the dispute is. Now, I think there's some confusion as far as leverage, so if it's a legitimate claim, you can't really be super aggressive against them, or it's not wise to, right? So to keep it simple, if it's a counterfeit claim and you're not really sure if the products are counterfeit, you're not going to threaten them with legal, with litigation, for example. But if, let's say, it's baseless, the products are legitimate, that's when it's a bit different. So I always recommend when you're contacting sellers to start it off attempting to resolve the dispute amicably. You don't have to go to war right out of the gate. And it doesn't even always make sense to, because there could be, let's say, a small amount of inventory at issue. Maybe it's a product that's not even profitable, or it's a very thin margin. So at the end of the day, the number one thing that most sellers are concerned about, preserving their account health, right? To make sure that the account stays in good standing and is not suspended. Number two is to make sure that their top selling products are up and running. So if it doesn't really fall into one of those categories, then it's usually not as serious. But in general, you do want to try and keep your account as clean as you can. So again, when I do reach out, you want to try and resolve it amicably first, and then see how they reply. And then from there, if they try and reverse the burden of proof, or if they ignore you, then you have other options as far as how to proceed.
Yeah. So is it likely that they don't respond?
So I find that when because a lot of times when sellers contact me, they already tried reaching out on their own.
Yeah.
And I've seen a general trend where they tend to get either more brands ignoring them, or, they'll be less friendly, they're less willing to try and resolve something amicably. And it's usually a different tone when, I don't know if it's just the attorney letterhead where it's just taken a bit more seriously. But when I respond, it's not super common that we're ignored completely. Now, sometimes they're very willing to retract, very willing to enter into some sort of an agreement. Sometimes they're not as willing to do so. But in general, no, it's not super common, especially if you have a legal letter that's being submitted.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was more towards what you just said. People would have already contacted, and the
Yeah.
other bands wouldn't have responded. So okay, it's good. So the other thing I wanted to talk about were how to go through the complaints process and appeal. You've already described the process on that one. So um, and this, if you've been working in this field for a while, um, and how common you are seeing? Is it more common now than few years back? So what sort of situation you are seeing it now?
As far as IP in general, it's still very common. I think it's always been common. So yeah, I mean, I would say in general, it's just as common as it's been for a long time. I think sellers are a little bit more in tune as far as how to deal with some of these issues. So, which is a good thing. Amazon does have some more complicated procedures in place than they used to. So for example, back in, I don't remember the year, but it was probably in 2017, 2018, somewhere in that time frame, where if a counterfeit complaint came up, Amazon was reinstating sellers left and right, even if they didn't really have the proper documentation. And now it's way more difficult. Even sometimes if they do have the proper documentation, Amazon gives sellers a hard time, or you have to follow up numerous times. So I would say the complaints are just as common. They're just a bit tougher to resolve these days.
Hmm. I think for anybody, we're successfully selling well, and sometimes these sort of complaints do happen. And sometimes I think it's not legit as well. So, which is something not very nice, but that happens, I would hope. Okay, cool. Right. So I think we're towards the end of this podcast. So thank you, David, for your time again. Before we go, it's good for listeners to know if there is an issue. How do I contact you? How do we contact you?
Yeah, sure. So email address is david@damlawfirm.com, and phone number is 516-313-1572.
Okay. And for everyone who's listening to the podcast, David will be with us in Amherst later in October in Brighton. So if you want to talk to him and see him and talk about your account, your situation, come and see us at Amherst in Brighton in October.
Looking
Right.
forward to it.
Yeah, excellent. So, all right. Okay. Thank you, David.